Hi everyone, this is Jewish history class. Today we want to start to talk about the Nazi Holocaust. And this is a really big topic. It's one that I approach with both a lot of experience and no small amount of trepidation, given how emotionally fraught it is. And really how in depth it as a topic deserves to be treated. And this is a class where it's just a small component of it. I do, as some of you know, and some of you have taken, use this as the topic for my historical methods course, and we go greatly into depth in that class. I've also taught a history of genocide course a couple of times. And spent 2 weeks of that course on the Holocaust, and so suffice it to say that I don't think I'm going to be able to do justice here to the scope of this whole thing, or the emotional or analytical depth that it deserves. But it is a topic that must be treated in a Jewish history course. We would be terribly negligent not to do this, and so. In any case, I will try to cover as much material as I possibly can, and treat it with the gravity that it deserves to be treated with. And we can have further discussion about any of the issues that you desire as we go forward here. This video lecture will be devoted to an exploration of some of the central questions about the Holocaust. The first of these is displayed already on the screen here. Why Germany? I'll get to that in just a second. And then it will follow kind of chronologically up to the beginning of the Second World War, when the killing starts in earnest. Not that it wasn't already happening to some extent, but it is upped tremendously after the beginning of the war. The war really creates the conditions for the mass extermination of the Jews, and most of the tragedy that we see happens under the guise of war, and so there will be a second lecture devoted to that. So the first question that we should ask is, why Germany? Why, in this of all European places, did the Holocaust happen? As some have seen it, the culmination of centuries of anti-Jewish persecution and anti-Semitic racial thinking. Why did that happen in Germany? A lot of scholars have tried to answer this question, and they have arrived at radically different answers. There was a book that caused no small amount of stir, written in the mid-1990s by a political scientist at Harvard, Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, called Hitler's Willing Executioners, where Goldhagen essentially said in that book that this was just in the German character, to hate Jews, to persecute them, that the Germans really couldn't help themselves, that this was baked into their national character. Goldhagen's conclusions, and this was a bestseller, not least in Germany, actually. It was translated into German. It sold a lot of copies there. German people found this very compelling as a kind of exercise in personal psychology or political identity building or whatever it was. But for whatever reason, it really resonated with audiences in Germany. But scholars quickly countered this and said, there were a number of problems that scholars pointed out. One is that Goldhagen is not very careful with his use of sources, but he really did what, at least this was some of the criticism leveled at him, amounts to stereotyping, and saying, the Germans were the only ones who could have done this, and this is because this is what Germans are like, and that seemed, to some at least, a problematic exercise. Others have, developed a more nuanced kind of case for why Germany. But what it amounts to in large part is that Germany gives itself over to a brand of fascism and socialism that had racial ideology and a particularly virulent form of anti Semitic ideology, in particular, baked into it. That Germany perpetrates the Holocaust, or is the kind of catalyst for this whole thing. We shouldn't level all or lay all of this at the feet of the Germans because there were a lot of other participants in this. But it does this because uh, Nazi ideology, National Socialism, um, is has anti-Semitism at its core, and this was the purpose of the Nazi Party and Nazi racial ideology. That this was their central goal, and that essentially is why Germany is the one that did this. From in my own personal opinion, as a scholar of primarily of medieval Germany, I tend to agree with that. Right, Germany has been called by some the land of persecution, at least vis-a-vis the Jews, but I don't see that for the eras previous to the 20th century. Yes, there's plenty of anti-Jewish persecution. There are pogroms. There are in the Middle Ages, ritual murder accusations and things like this in Germany, but to no greater extent than in other places in Europe, and um, I think it's even safe to say to a lesser extent than we see in some other countries in Europe, especially France, which is far more virulently anti-Jewish, especially legally and politically in the Middle Ages than Germany is. Um, France expels its Jews twice in the 12th and early 14th centuries. England, of course, expels the Jews in 1290. The Jews are not expelled ever from the German Reich during the Middle Ages. They are expelled from individual cities at times, but there's not much there that would lend itself to the idea that Germany has been for many centuries anti-Semitic, and that everything is leading up to the Holocaust in Germany. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And even in the modern period, I think if one were to go back to the early part of the 20th century and be told that there was going to be a mass killing of Jews somewhere in Europe, I'm not sure that the people at the time would have said, "Oh, that's going to happen in Germany," obviously, because even though there was anti-Semitism there, it was everywhere. And of course, the most kind of famous anti-Semitic incidents in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries were happening in Western Europe, at least in France, with the Dreyfus Affair, and of course in Eastern Europe in Russia, right, with the series of pogroms there. And so Russia probably would have been the assumption. Anyway, that's I want to sort of clear the air with this question about why Germany. In my opinion, this has everything to do with the Nazis and the kind of radicalism that happens in Germany. There was a great deal of political extremism in the era after the First World War in Europe. While culturally Europe was to some extent following the lead of the United States, though it was of course doing its own thing too, in participating in the Roaring Twenties. I mean, people were playing big band music and dancing the Charleston and wearing flapper dresses in Europe as much as they were in the United States. But on the other hand, the kind of economic and political scene, and even to some extent the culture, was far darker and more pessimistic in Europe due to the horrors of the First World War. And for some, the First World War turned out the way it did, especially in Germany, turned out the way it did because there were not only enemies from without, but even more importantly, that there were enemies within, right? And of course, one of those who held this opinion was Adolf Hitler, but he was not alone in this. And so, given the depths of economic depression that occurred in Germany, especially in 1923-24, when Germany defaulted on its war reparation payments, and large sections of its most industrialized territory were seized by France, Germany fell into a deep depression. You may have seen, pictures of people hauling around wheelbarrows full of Deutschmarks that had absolutely no value to them. The economy entirely collapsed. The currency collapsed, and Germany was deeply in trouble. And these are the kinds of conditions that lend themselves to political extremism. That, coupled with, Germany, according to the Versailles Treaty, being forced to accept that they were solely at fault for the horrors of the First World War, which of course was simply false. But these are the exactions made in the Treaty of Versailles by the French and the British. And so, Germany gave itself over certainly by the late 1920s to a good deal of political extremism. And even though the Weimar Republic did make some strides to improve the economy and to stabilize the political system, the Nazis only grew in popularity due mostly to perceptions about where the country was headed, right? And this extremism was not just in Germany, of course. Mussolini came to power in 1922. That's another fascist regime. You have the rise of, Franco's regime in Spain, which did not ever join with Germany and Italy in the war, but there's another kind of ultra-right fascist regime there. And we can see this in Eastern Europe, groups like the Arrow Cross in Hungary, the irredentism and anti-Semitism, that cropped up in Eastern Europe was in many cases nearly as virulent or just as virulent as it was in Germany. So this is in the air, so to speak, right? Now, we could spend an entire class period talking about Nazi racial ideology. I have laid the groundwork for a lot of this in the lecture on anti-Semitism, so I don't want to belabor the point too much. But there are a couple of these ideas that have been floated for a few decades at this point. The idea that the German people in particular were part of the master race, the Aryans, right? And the characteristics like blonde hair and blue eyes were part and parcel of this master race. Hitler and Alfred Rosenberg and other kind of ideologues among the National Socialists wrote at length about these things, even kind of laying out a hierarchy of races. And despite the fact that de Gobineau and other racial theorists of the late 19th century did not really comment on the Jews. Now, there were, of course, plenty of anti-Semitic thinkers who did comment on the Jews and tried to fit them into these racial hierarchies. No one did this to the level that Hitler and his ilk did in the 1920s and 30s. Hitler in Mein Kampf and Alfred Rosenberg, who was kind of the chief Nazi racial ideologist, and Goebbels, the propaganda minister, and several others, wrote lengthy treatises on kind of this racial hierarchy that put the Aryans at the top, put the Mediterranean peoples beneath them as racial inferiors, and then kind of descending down this hierarchy, the Asian peoples below that, and then Black Africans at the bottom of the hierarchy. The Jews are an exception, and they're marked for particular analysis and opprobrium in these racial rantings of people like Adolf Hitler. Hitler and Rosenberg and others saw the Jews as the most inferior race on the one hand, but it wasn't just that they were inferior, that they lay below, Asians and Africans in this racial hierarchy. But sorry for the background noise here. I'm sure some of you are facing this. I'll need to pause for a second. Sorry, my 5-year-old was looking for my wife, I think. Anyway, the Jews they were not just the lowest in this ranking of races. It wasn't just that they were, inherently inferior according to this ideology. It was that they were corrosive. Hitler and others held that the Jews had purposefully infiltrated all of these other races and spread their inferior genetic material into the master races in an effort to corrupt them purposely. This is all part of a big plot. And that they had infiltrated Germany, they had infiltrated the army, they had infiltrated the government, they had infiltrated the businesses, specifically to bring them down, to undermine and destroy them, right? And so the Jews were not only inferior, they were sinister and purposeful in their corruption of the master race. And so it was essential that the Aryans recognize this and take steps to defend themselves. Hitler believed and wrote that the Jewish genetic kind of material was actually far stronger than the Aryan was. That it took a great deal of effort for the Aryans to maintain their racial purity, and that even a single drop of Jewish blood, or a tiny component of inferior Jewish racial material would have a corrosive effect for generations. That this simply needed to be eradicated, right? And the Jews were not the only ones kind of marked out for as racial inferiors, and even as kind of corrosive plotters. The Romani, or pejoratively called the Gypsies, were similarly marked out. Black Africans were held up as racial inferiors, and had there been a larger population of Black Africans in Germany, they would have died in similar numbers, almost certainly. If Germany had taken over large parts of Africa, we would have seen mass slaughter of African peoples. I have no doubt about that. But the Jews, because they lived in large numbers in German lands, were the most feared of all of these people. Now, this conspiracy, this supposed conspiracy that the Jews were involved in, and some of this came from texts like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which the Nazis circulated everywhere and held up as absolute truth about what the Jews were up to. But given that Hitler was a veteran of the First World War, that he was wounded in a gas attack, that he had earned an Iron Cross second class, so he was a decorated war veteran, right? He saw the loss of the First World War not as the very complex thing that it was, partly the peace negotiations, partly the kind of realities of the battlefield, but instead simply as a betrayal of the Germans by the Jews. The Jews were the ones who had orchestrated this defeat, had orchestrated the peace terms, the Versailles Treaty, and all of that. That the Jews were entirely responsible for all of Germany's losses, all of Germany's humiliations, and that this amounted to what Hitler called the stab in the back. Okay, so that's where the Jews stood in Nazi racial ideology. There is no room for compromise in any of this. Now, this is not to say that the Holocaust is solely the responsibility of Hitler, or even of the Nazi central leadership. There is plenty of blame, plenty of guilt to go around in all of this, but the racial ideology certainly played a role. Not all Germans believe this, but the Nazis definitely did believe this. They held this as absolute truth. This was not really a skeptical thing. This was not just a tale they were telling. It seems that they believed this with all of their hearts, and this may help to explain why they took some of the actions that they did, which really don't make a lot of sense when looked at, just kind of on their own, separated from this ideology. The Nazi rise to power is this is a a rather complex sequence of events. The democratic regime put into place after the First World War, the Weimar Republic, was seen by many in Germany as corrupt and as culturally and politically decadent. Right, Berlin, in particular, had a reputation for as being a kind of den of vice. There were a lot of um, nightclubs. There was a very vibrant gay cultural scene in Berlin in the 1920s. A lot of the culture, the music, the dress, the dance, things like this were imported from the United States and from Paris, which to conservative Germans was unacceptable. That how we can't allow these things that come from these corrupt and decadent places to infiltrate German culture. A lot of this was laid at the feet of the Jews. It was thought that the Jews were the ones who were responsible for big band music and swing dancing and the Charleston and flapper dresses and the scandalous behavior of young people, that these were all Jewish attempts to corrupt good German culture, good traditional German culture. At least that's how the Nazis and other extremists portrayed it, right? If we analyze the Weimar Republic kind of on its own, separate from its eventual demise, we can see, I think a good faith effort to try to deal with some very, very difficult issues, and even in some cases some progress in this, but with the inability to stem the tide of extremism, right? Hitler really didn't, per se, steal power. It was given to him. He became chancellor, partly because the Nazis were growing in popularity. After Hitler's failed putsch, his failed takeover of the government in 1923, his subsequent jailing, and while he was in prison, he wrote Mein Kampf. He wasn't there very long. He was released after serving only a portion of his initial sentence. But Mein Kampf became a bestseller. And a lot of German people read this, and of course, over the course of the Nazi regime, this became the book that circulated in every home. This was traditionally given as a gift when a child came of age, or as a wedding gift, or whatever, right? So Mein Kampf would become kind of like the Bible of the Nazis. But even in its initial phase, it was fairly, it gained popularity quickly. The Nazis won some seats in the Reichstag, the German parliament, and I just realized I forwarded it. Sorry, but that popularity did seem to plateau in the early 1930s, and therefore it is somewhat horribly ironic, or at least coincidental, that Hitler was appointed chancellor. The government, and I'm not going to go into all of the details about this, but the leaders of government kind of gave it to Hitler in a way to show that the Nazis were not that capable, and that they could manipulate Hitler and perhaps even blame the Nazis for some of the things the government was failing in. But the Nazis did make an initial show of strength and of making good decisions. And Hitler's popularity after becoming chancellor, and by extension the popularity of the Nazis, grew tremendously, to the point that only a few months after taking power, they were able to take steps that would have been unthinkable before. Things like banning other political parties and initiating laws by decree that were racial in character and discriminatory against Jews and others. And the politics of the 1920s and 30s are, if you really delve into these things, very foreign. They are more akin to what we see in extremist groups today, but that was the mainstream. Political parties had their own paramilitary operations that were often regimented, that had ranks and basic training, and that carried around weapons and would use this to intimidate their political opponents, even attack them physically. This was actually the norm, right? The Nazis had a paramilitary organization called the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the brown uniformed figures who would show up at Nazi party rallies, and if protesters made their way there, if Nazi opponents made their way there, they would engage in violence against them, right? And this was not out of the norm. The SD, only a couple of years after Hitler came to power, though, fell out of favor, and Hitler had its leaders assassinated, including Ernst Röhm, who was the head of the SD, assassinated, and the SD was folded into other units, and this other group called the Schutzstaffel, the SS, became Hitler's favorite and really took over the roles, not just in the party, but in the state that had formerly been occupied by several groups, several different organizations. And that would be key to the way that the Holocaust proceeded. The other thing, in addition to kind of this paramilitary and the use of violence, the sanctioned use of violence, was that the Nazis were really good at propaganda. They were good at putting on a show, good at portraying themselves as strong, good at convincing others that the Nazis were the key to German prosperity. And nowhere can we see this, I think, better than in the documentary film that the Nazis arranged to be made about their September 1934 party congress in the city of Nuremberg. That there was a young filmmaker, Leni Riefenstahl, a female filmmaker who was close to Hitler and other senior Nazi leaders. And, if you have, some of you may have seen parts or all of Triumph of the Will. The shot here on the bottom right of the screen is a still from Triumph of the Will. And, this film is all about the pageantry of the Nazis. It begins with Hitler descending out of the clouds, almost like a god coming down from on high to the city of Nuremberg. So the first shots are in the airplane that Hitler's riding in. Then he comes into Nuremberg. He's met by the entire population of this city with great aplomb. They turn out in parades, waving Nazi flags for him. The entire city is decked out in the swastika and in German flags, and Hitler rides through the city to the cheers of everyone. Different groups greet him. We've got workers, there are farmers. One of the most interesting and also, I think, disturbing scenes is of the camp of the Hitlerjunge, the Hitler Youth Brigade. And it's almost like Boy Scout camp, but then, you see all of these young men, and with hindsight, that probably the vast majority of all of these boys they were boys in 1934 would later go off and die in places like Stalingrad, right? That almost all of them almost certainly were wiped out. That they're having a great time. They're engaged in games. They're shaving and bathing and teasing each other, and then they show up, to hear Hitler give this great speech about the future of Germany, how they will carry Germany to even greater heights, heights that they can't even imagine at this point, right? That's all very eerie to watch, I think, with hindsight, knowing what happened to the vast majority of these people. But this was all a great spectacle, and the Nazis gained popularity because they were good at manipulating the spectacle. They also had, of course, publications. The most notorious of these was called Der Stürmer, the Stormer, which was under the direction of one of the most virulent anti-Semitic and ardent Nazis, a guy named Julius Streicher. And you may have seen political cartoons. I meant to put some of these on the PowerPoint, but I neglected to do that somehow, so my apologies. But you have all sorts of these political cartoons. They're almost pornographic in nature at times. You've got the caricature of the Jew with the big nose and the big round belly, and the kind of Jewish banker who is, pulling the strings of international finance. Often, you have the juxtaposition of a a good traditional German maiden with her, beautiful features and her blonde hair, and then you have like this fat, leering Jew looking at her, like he's about to sexually assault her or something like that. I mean, it's that's where it becomes really quite pornographic in nature. And these publications the Nazis put out, like Der Stürmer, had tremendous readership. They were highly popular, and this just became part of the cultural parlance of the 1930s. Well, with all of that as the background, the Nazis took increasingly bold steps to first marginalize the Jews and then to outright persecute them. And this occurred to some extent in fits and starts, but it was obvious where they were headed almost from the beginning, right? Even within a couple of months of Hitler being appointed as chancellor, there were restrictions placed on Jews serving in the civil service. And other legal strictures put into place very, very quickly, even as early as April and May 1933. Hitler became chancellor at the end of January 1933, and 3 months later, or no, 2 months later, really, they're already doing these things. They created racial categories, initially just non-Aryan, but eventually they became more and more defined, right? And this culminated to some extent in the 1935 so-called Nuremberg laws. The city of Nuremberg was a kind of notorious Nazi center, and even today, not to say it's still Nazified, it's not. Nuremberg is a beautiful, wonderful city with a tremendous history that has nothing to do with the Nazis, but this is the one place where you can still see some of the kind of Nazi footprint. The old parade ground is still there. Germany has preserved this as a kind of memory of the Nazis. Really, it's a place that where you go to be educated about what the Nazis were doing in an effort to make sure that this never happens again. But the Party Congress Hall is still there. You can see kind of the Nazi. Well, there's a whole kind of architectural component to this, right? Much of this the vision of Hitler's cultural minister Albert Speer. But anyway, that's Nuremberg is commonly associated with the Nazis for a variety of reasons. These laws, not the least of these. But you can see one of the central image here is of well, this is Die Nürnberger Gesetze, the Nuremberg laws. In this case, it's talking about the categories, right? And the distinctions here: Deutschblutiger, so German blood, right? And it's showing that if your parents came from, German stock, or your grandparents, right, then you were defined as somebody of German blood, as an Aryan. Then we have over here, if your grandparents were all Jewish, you're obviously Jewish. If like a certain number of your grandparents were, then you're Jewish. And then you have these mixed categories. In fact, they're called Mischlinge. And the Jews are portrayed in blacks with black circles here, right? Like it's a black mark. If you have a single Jewish grandparent and you're recorded Jewish, you're still considered a racial inferior, right? If you have two Jewish grandparents, then you are an even higher degree of an inferior, and then it descends from there to a full Jew. And these are the categories, and there are distinctions given to each of these categories, and there were strictures placed on them legally. They were subject to abuse officially in a number of ways. The Nuremberg laws specifically forbade any kind of sexual contact between, Deutschblutiger, the Aryan people, and people of inferior racial blood, either Jews or Mischlinge. And certainly no marriage between them. Those who were already married to Jews had tremendous pressure placed on them to get a divorce, and in some cases were, even arrested and charged with violating these laws, even if the marriage went back before this. Citizenship for Jews and others was revoked. There were quotas placed on Jews in educational institutions, in certain professions. Only a certain number of Jews could be doctors and other things, right? And as we talked about in a previous lecture, this is the time when a lot of Jewish intellectuals, a lot of Jewish elites began to flee Germany. Scientists like Albert Einstein got out of Central Europe and went off to the United States to escape this spreading wave. The Nazis also did very symbolic cultural things and propagandistic things, like massive book burnings. This picture up here is of a book burning in, I think, May 1933, when books written by Jews, things that were considered culturally corrosive, were rounded up and burnt in large numbers, and you can see them giving the Nazi salute there. This is someone in a Hitler Youth uniform. This is either I can't tell from the uniform exactly. This is the SS uniform, the black one. But there are, and then we've got Nazi armbands here, right? And so, this is all kind of political theater. Then there were segregation measures, things like park benches and public toilet facilities and the like had signs appear that said "No Jews allowed." Restaurants, certain businesses, right? Lots of boycotts of Jewish businesses, even very early on in the Nazi regime, in an attempt to really kind of break the any power the Jews held over the German economy. All of that is happening at an increasing pace. Now, there is a kind of breather in the mid-1930s because the Germans were hosting the Olympic Games in summer of 1936 in Berlin. This, of course, the most famous athlete to come out of that was Jesse Owens, the black or the African-American sprinter and long jumper who won 4 gold medals. It was difficult for Hitler to explain that one, but given that he is supposedly a racial inferior, right? Jews were not forbidden from competing in the games, and to some extent the execution of the Nuremberg laws was put on hold so that the international community coming to witness the Olympic Games and compete in them would not be spooked by what the Nazis were doing there. But it began again in earnest right after the Olympic Games. Talked about the boycotts and the book burnings. Maybe the most sinister is just the random violence, and you can see this to some extent carried into the Zhernikov book, even though that of course is in Poland after the beginning of the war. The kinds of things that Zhernikov describes happening in Warsaw in late 1939, early 1940, where people who may have had Jewish enemies for whatever reason, a business deal gone bad, a Jewish neighbor they didn't like for whatever reason, were emboldened to simply commit random acts of violence against Jews. And by the party line, the Jews were not to be protected, and the police often just looked the other way in these cases, or even worse, in some cases, blamed the Jews for the violence that was perpetrated against them. This is one of the most difficult to kind of wrap our minds around that this could happen, but it happened repeatedly. One might wonder why, given the dissolving, deteriorating state of Jewish life in Germany, why the Jews simply didn't leave. They had done this at times, right, in Jewish history. Well, let's remember that the Jews had been in Germany for many centuries, that things had gotten kind of okay. That assimilation and acculturation had happened largely in Western and Central Europe by this point. And, perhaps with the hope that this would all just go away. The German people would come to their senses, that things would go back to the way they used to be, where some people may not like Jews, but and there's still anti-Semitic talk, but not this level of opprobrium and legal and other persecution, right? But moreover, I think it's pretty obvious that a lot of Jews were simply not equipped to immigrate. I mean, there were immigration quotas placed on Jews in the United States, for instance, in 1924. We talked about the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924. There were quotas in place in other places too. Britain did accept some Jews, but not large numbers of them. And so, and to immigrate, you really kind of have to have connections. And, in the late 1930s, many Jews did try to leave, but by that point it was often too late. One case that has come to greater light only in the last 10, 15 years is the case of the Frank family. The most famous member of the Frank family, of course, being Anne Frank, or Anna Frank. But her father, Otto, some evidence came to light a few years ago that he tried desperately to immigrate to America in the late 1930s. He tried to take his family away from Germany, that he petitioned people in the American government who were kind of contacts of contacts or friends of friends, but that his immigration request was denied by the U.S., prompting him to leave and eventually make it to Amsterdam, where he holed up, of course, in the upstairs room of a building for many years with his family, and that's where we get the Diary of Anne Frank. As things got worse and worse, there were a lot of people who did try to leave, even if their prospects for leaving were not so good. We can see, I think, the apex of the legal persecution and violence in, I shouldn't say the apex, really, I guess the culmination may be the better word, because of course things are going to get much worse once the war starts, but the pre-war culmination of all of this legal persecution and random violence occurs on November 9th, 1938, this period known as, or this event known as Kristallnacht, the night of smashed glass. And this is a famous photo down here in the bottom right corner of the slide of the aftermath of Kristallnacht. But all over the country, crowds attacked Jewish businesses, Jewish homes, burned down Jewish synagogues, and left violence in their wake, beat up Jews. Thousands of Jews were rounded up and arrested, and harassed, and shaken down for money. And the Nazis tried. Goebbels seems to have been, Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, seems to have been the architect of this whole thing. There is some correspondence between him and Adolf Hitler, where Hitler was like, why did you do that? Why did this happen the way it did? This may not look good for us internationally. Goebbels did this in an effort to try to please the Fuhrer, and but Hitler, embraced it ultimately. In any case, the Nazis tried to make this look like the spontaneous outbreak of frustration against the Jews who had fleeced the Germans for so long that they just couldn't take it anymore. But in reality, this was entirely orchestrated by the Nazis. That the Nazis had used their stormtroopers, had used SS in plain clothes to perpetrate the violence and try to draw crowds into it. In some cases, they succeeded in this. But there was initially some backlash against this, some condemnation, which is why Hitler may have been a bit frustrated in the immediate aftermath with the results of it, right? But after Kristallnacht, Jewish life really ceased to exist in any predictable manner. The war started only a few months later, and the Jews were stuck there, not able to leave at that point without taking seriously dangerous measures, bribing lots of people, crossing borders where there were war zones and things. So Kristallnacht really is a kind of end point of this pre-war persecution phase. Now, in the meantime, and sort of overlapping with all of this, the Nazis set up these things called concentration camps. The purpose, at least the stated purpose, and the Nazis did not try to hide these. They broadcast them to the German public. They even allowed for international observers to go in and have a look at what was going on in these things. But the purpose was to round up political dissidents and people who would potentially be a threat to the German nation, to individual communities, people who might commit acts of violence or whatever. The Nazis were especially concerned with the spread of communism. After the Bolshevik Revolution, we see this kind of extremism in the 1920s that I was talking about. And so the Nazis take a position on the far right, and the communists, of course, are on the far left. And so these two hate each other. The Nazis very quickly associated Jews because there were some Jews involved with the Bolsheviks. People like Leon Trotsky and other, kind of Bolshevik leaders were Jewish, at least in ethnicity, and so they tried to, portray communism as a Jewish conspiracy against the rest of the world and all of that, right? So the Germans rounded up communists, or I should say, the Nazis rounded up communists and put them in these concentration camps. But this quickly became a place where they sent people they considered to be racial inferiors, Jews and Romani, and also kind of religious dissidents, the Jehovah's Witnesses, for instance, because of their kind of anti-political, anti-social stance, their refusal to recognize sort of national identities and things like this, right? They were seen as a threat, and so Jehovah's Witnesses were often arrested and placed in these things. The first of these concentration camps was Dachau. And both of these pictures actually are of Dachau. The top one is of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, visiting Dachau, observing what was going on there in, this is circa 1936 or 37. The bottom one is this phrase in German, Arbeit macht frei, became the cynical theme of the concentration camp. Work makes free, right? If you do what you're supposed to, if you work here, then you will be free, you will be allowed back into society. But of course, that's just mocking. Nothing could be further from the truth, right? So for the purpose of the concentration camps. This was followed by Sachsenhausen in 1936, and then Buchenwald in 1937. From there, especially after the war starts, there's just a whole proliferation of these camps, both in Germany and especially in the newly conquered territories, Poland and Czechoslovakia and other places have these camps, right? And their purpose begins to change too. The camps were eventually fell under the control of the SS. In 1936, all of the police forces, the Gestapo or the secret police, the various different police forces that existed in Germany were put under the command of a single individual, that is Heinrich Himmler, again pictured here in the top picture on the slide, who was the head of the SS. And so the SS assumed control over all of that. And as a special unit, one that was not subject to any sort of legal or political review, the SS could operate as a state within a state. They made their own decisions. They could arrest people with impunity without any sort of due process, without even identifying why a person had been arrested, put them in concentration camps, give no account for why they were doing this. And it's really at this point that they start to arrest Jews just because they're Jews, and to place them in concentration camps and subject them to the increasingly horrific conditions in these camps. When the Germans expand politically and diplomatically by first annexing Bohemia, or the Czech portion of Czechoslovakia, and then the Sudetenland specifically, which is the kind of the western part, the Germanized part of that. But then the Anschluss, or the annexation of Austria in 1938. These places had large numbers of Jews in them. The Germans living in these places were, in some cases, virulently anti-Semitic. Vienna, for instance, had some of the most ardent kind of anti-Semitic groups and opinions of any city in Europe. And so this was all absorbed into the Reich and fed this growing animosity to the Jews, and emboldened the Nazis to take steps to, well, further marginalize and even start to eradicate the Jews from the German presence. And so what we're left with before the war is what the Germans themselves, what the Nazis themselves called the Jewish question. And that is simply, what do we do with the Jews whom we don't want in our society, right? At the beginning of the war, that question did not have a secure answer. There were some Nazi officials who were thinking primarily about mass forced immigration. To send the Jews off to some other place, well away from the German lands, to rid Germany entirely of the Jewish presence. When Germany, for instance, defeated France in 1940 and took over, at least kind of legally and politically, all of France's colonial possessions, there were Nazi officials who talked about sending all the Jews off to Madagascar. That was a place that they floated as a possibility. There were some who seem already to have believed, Himmler is probably one of them, that the only solution to the Jewish question, the only real answer to this, was full eradication, full extermination, and that the concentration camps could potentially be key to this. But it's not until a couple of years into the war that any firm decisions are made about this. Now, that may seem strange, especially if one hasn't sort of been schooled on the nuances of the way the Nazis functioned, and the way that Hitler stood at the head of all of this thing more as a symbolic figure and kind of ideologue than anything. As a guy who gave a really good speech and could whip up a crowd into a frenzy. Was really good at political theater, and had a lot of supporters and underlings who kowtowed to him and catered to his every whim, and whose chief kind of characteristic was their loyalty to Hitler and their willingness to fawn over every decision he made. Right, Hitler had a lot of toadies. But the way that the Nazis actually functioned was that Hitler would make statements, and this is really what's called the functionalist argument for the Holocaust, why the Holocaust happened, that Hitler would make statements about what he wanted, right? So Hitler made a speech just before the war started where he said, if the international Jewish conspiracy succeeds in sinking the world into another world war, this will result not in the ascendancy of the Jews, but rather in the eradication of the Jews, in their extermination. Right? Now, there are so many things, of course, wrong with that statement that, we could pause and kind of analyze it, right? Because it wasn't the Jews, of course, who were marching the drumbeat of war, but that's just how Hitler always portrayed them, as the ones who were pulling the strings on everything and leading everyone along the path to war. But Hitler, in saying that, opened a door for his underlings to then say, okay, the Fuhrer wants the Jews to be exterminated. And especially after the war started, there was a real impetus to prove the Fuhrer prophetic, right? That if he made a statement that this is what the result would be, well, we need to make sure that that is the result. And so let's put our minds to exterminating the Jews, right? To doing them in entirely. And, scholars kind of puzzled for years over the fact that there is no smoking gun. There is no statement where Hitler signs a document that says, kill all the Jews. It doesn't exist, right? And instead, we have to acknowledge that the Nazis really were kind of messy in the way they functioned. That again, Hitler was the one who made the statements, and then his underlings would put that into practice, would make sure that the Fuhrer looked good in the execution of it. And so this happened more piecemeal, and it often happened in ways where different Nazis were doing different things that sometimes clashed with each other, but the long and short of it was, of course, that vast numbers of Jews and others, Romani, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, political dissidents, millions and millions of Poles and Russians and others were murdered at the hands of the Nazis in one of the worst humanitarian disasters in human history. So that's where we'll head next time, and we'll talk about what happens after the war starts. If you have questions, please feel free to bring them up on discussion boards or in one of our Zoom meetings. Thank you.